So, hello everybody, and welcome to this first talk of the first meeting of the new edition of the Open Research Seminar for the academic year 2025-2026. I'm Marco Storni. I work as a postdoc in the project RENEW18, Responses to Newton's Mathematical Experimental Paradigm in 18th Century Philosophy. And this seminar we're holding, the Open Research Seminar, is, as you may know, an online platform to discuss ongoing research on Isaac Newton and early modern natural philosophy and philosophy more generally. So it is my pleasure to introduce Corey Dyck, who is here with us exceptionally for a hybrid session. So he's here and he will be in Brussels in person. Corey is professor of philosophy at the University of Western Ontario, specializes in the history of German philosophy, particularly the 18th century. His recent research has focused on issues in metaphysics, in the philosophy of mind, in the period that goes from Leibniz to Kant, roughly. I'd like to recall one major publication of Corey's, namely the monograph Wolff in the first 50 years of German metaphysics, published by Oxford University Press in 2024, of which we'll discuss a chapter today. I'd also like to cite other publications, notably two edited books, one entitled Women and Philosophy in 18th Century Germany, also published by Oxford University Press in 2021, and Early Modern German Philosophy, 1690-1750, published also by Oxford University Press in 2019. Today's session and his talk, Corey's talk for today, is entitled Wolff's Emendation of Ontology and His Step to Newton. So we'll have the pleasure to listen to Corey's talk for about 20-25 minutes, and then we will discuss based on the talk and the text we've all read. So, thank you again, Corey, and welcome to Brussels.
Thank you very much. Just so everybody knows online, there's 6 of us in the room here, and we're using my computer as the one that's the microphone and the speakers. So others will look like they're talking, but you'll be getting the audio from my computer. So it looks like my mic is the one that's on. Great. So thanks for having me here. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for accommodating me as well. It turned out I was going to be in Belgium anyway at this time, so I'm glad that we could arrange a more intimate and personal kind of meeting. I'm just going to share the PowerPoint presentation that I have. As Marco said, it's maybe a little longer than what's conventional for this group, but I didn't want to presuppose that you'd all read the chapter, and I wanted to remind myself of some of the things I said, so I have a bit of a longer presentation than maybe as usual. Okay, so the title of it is Wolff's Emendation of Ontology and His Debt to Newton. I should also say I am by no means a Newton scholar. If you did read the chapter, that is probably painfully clear. I'm a Wolff scholar who was interested in looking at the reception of Newton and British philosophy in general in early German philosophy and in Wolff particular. So I'm not a specialist on Newton by any means, but I'm certainly interested to hear what you thought of my account. So just general, setting out from maybe a common presupposition among this group too, I don't know. But it's long been presumed that British philosophers such as Locke and Newton did not exercise much of an influence on Wolff. And part of the reason for this is the intellectual insularity and conservatism of early modern Germany. Even so-called modernizing thinkers like Wolff stopped short of embracing the less modern intellectual trends of contemporary Britain and France, right? So they seem to, at least according to some, to be more invested in a much more conservative philosophical tradition and resisted those trends from abroad. But the reason why this is thought to be the case is also due to Wolff's close intellectual relationship with Leibniz. So whether it's because of the presumed opposition of rationalists and British empiricists, the personal antagonisms of Leibnizians and Newtonians, or Leibniz and, sorry, I just can't see part of my presentation here because of the faces, there we go, or Leibniz's own posthumously enacted philosophical dispute with Locke, it is assumed that Wolff, as an avowed Leibnizian, must have resisted any influence from British philosophy, that he was ultimately a party man, and he was on the side of Leibniz and the rationalists. Well, I think this presumption is unfounded. And if you've read any of my work on Wolff, you know that's the case. One might attack it from a number of directions by, for instance, rejecting the rationalist empiricist distinction, like Peter Anstey and Alberto Bonzo and others. Or you can reconsider Leibniz's own reception of Locke and consider Leibniz as a much more scientifically or empirically minded thinker than he typically is. But I'll challenge it by focusing on Wolff's early reception of British philosophy and Newton in particular. And I think that part of my thesis too is that it's because Wolff scholars, historians of early German philosophy haven't considered Wolff's early works that they miss the point of influence of British philosophy that was most important for Wolff. By his early works, I mean works before the German metaphysics. So these are very early works. From his first dissertation in 1702, all the way to the Ratio Praelectionum, which is the first account of his metaphysics as he was lecturing on it, that he published in 1718. Right, and it's going to be in the set of writings that constitute this early part of Wolff's corpus that I think we find a site of very important influence and engagement with British philosophy and Newton in particular. So we'll see that Wolff's reception of British philosophy is much more complex and important than has been recognized. Wolff's reception of these figures goes through multiple phases before the publication of the Deutsche Metaphysik in 1719, 1720. So it appeared in December of 1719, but it had a publication date of 1720. And this reception leaves important traces, both negative and positive, in Wolff's mature metaphysics, which I'm taking to be the Deutsche Metaphysik. But some might say that that's Wolff's early metaphysics, and the Ontologia and the Latin texts are his later ones, but that's not a dispute we're going to get into today. I will contend that Wolff's engagement with Newton and Newtonianism inspires considerable augmentations to Wolff's ontology and a reconsideration of its priority with respect to other topics of metaphysics. So I first present an important shift in Wolff's attitude towards ontology, and I end up attributing that to the influence of Newton and Clarke and Newtonianism on Wolff. So in fact, it's a rather profound impact on Wolff, his metaphysics. So I'll begin in the first section looking at Wolff's early encounters with British philosophy in general, though some of this is taken up in the first chapter of the book as well, but I'll present some of the context that's relevant for chapter 2. Then I'll look at this turning point, this idea of a Newtonian metaphysics that seems to scare Wolff enough to turn to metaphysics himself. And then present Wolff's idea of an amended ontology, an idea he borrows quite explicitly from Leibniz, but which he develops in his own direction, particularly in the Ratio Praelectionum, and then ultimately looking at the German metaphysics through that lens, you can see how that's an extension of his emendation project. And I'll claim that this is a response to Newtonianism and Newtonian metaphysics. Okay, so on the first topic, Wolff's early encounters with British philosophy. In 1703, he defended his habilitation, the Philosophia Practica Universalis. So it's a treatise on practical philosophy, an attempt to apply the mathematical method as he understood it then, largely through Tschirnhaus, to apply the mathematical method to practical issues. He has a later book, a multi-volume book on this with the same title that he published in the 1740s, but this is just a shorter dissertation. And Otto Menke was the examiner of that dissertation because he was the professor of moral philosophy at Leipzig at the time. As people in this room likely know, Menke was the founding editor of the Acta Eruditorum as well. And having been impressed by Wolff's mastery of the latest developments in mathematics, talks about algebra, for instance, in this dissertation, he signs Wolff up as a reviewer for Acta. And the charge is very specific. He wants Wolff to keep track of the Newtonians, what's coming out of England. Wolff didn't know English when he was hired. And so he says, according to his own autobiography, that he took the summer to learn. So some of these published in Latin, of course, there's a lot of English philosophy in general that's also being published in English. And Wolff by no means took his remit to be solely natural, scientific, mathematical works. He read widely. So indeed, he showed early interest in debates concerning the immateriality and immortality of the soul. He critically reviewed Daniel Whitby's Discourse of the Necessity and Usefulness of the Christian Revelation. He also reviewed another English treatise ascribed to Coward, but Paolo Rumori told me that Coward never wrote it, a discourse concerning the certainty of a future and immortal state. He also reviewed Dodwell's Epistolary Discourse, offering a not unsympathetic summary of Dodwell's detailed textual and philosophical case for the soul's natural mortality and the harmlessness of this doctrine for morality. So Wolff was actually quite actively interested in a lot of these other more kind of narrowly philosophical debates in England. And his critical attitude toward Dodwell is nonetheless evident when Wolff contends that Dodwell's challenge provoked his own efforts to clarify the concept of human reason and the soul in a later short essay of 1707. So part of his early works as well. I almost said his pre-critical works, but that would have been a mistake. Right, so Dodwell is already credited by Wolff with putting the question about the nature of human reason and how to explain various capacities that it has in this essay. He also, and this is probably surprising, he reviews Clarke's first response to Dodwell's letter, which response precipitated the exchange with Collins, the Clarke-Collins correspondence. In his review, Wolff approvingly summarizes Clarke's demonstration of the immateriality of the soul on the basis of the fact that consciousness cannot be attributed to a compound while preserving its unitary character. Right, so Wolff is drawing on some of these discussions as well. You can see in the Deutsche Metaphysik later on, right, his own proof of his own refutation of materialism draws on consideration that Clarke introduces, right? And so at this point in Wolff's career, Clarke is actually a positive influence on him, right? Wolff is quite sympathetic to Clarke's broader defense of these traditional doctrines, and Wolff cites Clarke approvingly here. And there's evidence as well that Wolff continued to read the Clarke-Collins correspondence, right? He didn't necessarily review it, but there's mentions of later exchanges that indicate that he continues to follow it. Significantly, though perhaps expectedly given his scientific interest, Wolff also closely followed and clearly admired the text by English and Scottish experimental philosophers and scientists, including Newton. So Wolff offers unqualified praise for Hooke in a lengthy review of his posthumous works, which also presents Hooke's mechanistic account of cognition without critical comment. And Boyle gains approving mention, with Wolff often referring to his experiments in his own works, right? So Wolff's own publications of sets of experiments and observations based on these. I should note, this is contentious. Reviews in this period are a specific genre all on their own, right? And it's frequently the case that a review, that Wolff will write a review, or any review in ACTA will just present a summary of the text, right? So it wouldn't necessarily be the expected venue for critical commentary, right? But rather just presenting a text in summary for people who might be interested. Indeed, it often happened that Wolff reviews his own books, right? But there's no signature by the author of the review. But it's interesting in that case because Wolff often draws attention to aspects of his books that modern readers might not find as interesting, but he's trying to highlight it. But so I think we can kind of infer or get a sense of a certain authorial and critical reaction to a work, depending on things that they choose to highlight or things that they quote in response or something like that. So there's often little ways you can determine the author's particular reception of a book. But that's all comes with a grain of salt, of course. This is my own claims. I should say too, Wolff's reviews of his own books are very important, I think. And especially at this period of his philosophy when his views are changing and developing in a lot of ways, it's important to see how, because the reviews come out later, how things have changed for Wolff in the interim and what themes he's really picking on. Anyway, given the circumstances of his cooperation with ACTA, it is also not surprising that Wolff reviewed works not only by Newton, but also by those in his inner circle, including reviews of texts by John Keel, George Cheney, and John Friend. I have to say that Newtonians have the hardest to pronounce last names in English. I don't know if that was a criterion of getting in, but in fact, Wolff engaged in a notable exchange with Keel in the pages of ACTA in 1709, 1710, which exchange was actually brought to Newton's attention and in which Leibniz ultimately became involved as well. Right, so Newton was aware of Wolff. Wolff was aware of Newton. Wolff had actual critical exchanges with Newtonians. Wolff's review of the first English edition of the Optics of 1704 was his first major review for ACTA. Right, it's a very lengthy review. And it gives, as I said, again, with a grain of salt, it gives no hint of any disagreements with Newton's method. But it's interesting that Wolff approvingly reproduces Newton's statement at the outset of Book 1, that Newton, will not explain the property of light by hypotheses, but by reason and experiment. So Wolff elevates that to the front of the review, right? And takes this as kind of a characteristic motto of the entire book. I say approvingly, but again, that's my own conjecture. Significantly, though hardly unexpectedly, Wolff's praise also extends to the first edition of the Principia, as he elsewhere identifies the underlying continuity between parts of their respective projects. So this is a number of texts from the late 1700s, the 17 noughts. So like the elements of areometrics of 1709, for instance, and some other more scientific works from around that time. So after making his frequent complaint about the abstruse character of the Principia, Wolff proceeds to claim that it was this that provoked him to show how indispensable the application of mathematics is to experiment and observation. Right, so he took this as Newton's signal achievement, and Wolff viewed himself in certain respects as just continuing that, extending it into other areas that Newton hadn't considered. Along these lines, Newton's efforts to apply mathematics to experiment to determine the nature of light and color, alongside Wolff's own efforts to do so in the measurement of air, are held up as a model in contrast with, for instance, Boyle's less mathematical approach to experimentation. Right? So Wolff is a big experimental philosopher, but he's of the Newtonian family. He thinks that there's a role for mathematics, for quantitative data in experimentation. At the same time, Wolff is interested in drawing a clear line between mathematics proper and his own mathematical method. My detailed account of the mathematical method is in chapter 1 of the book. In what might be plausibly taken as a reference to Newton's own presentation in the Principia, Wolff notes that just because an exposition includes the title of definitions and axioms, scholia, doesn't mean that it is executed in accordance with the mathematical method, right? So Wolff appreciates Newton's experimentalism, appreciates his introduction of mathematics into natural science, but he doesn't think that what he's doing is the same as what Wolff is doing in a philosophical context, that is to say, the application of the mathematical method. Right, and so he thinks it's just because of the superficial similarities between the two, Wolff thinks it's important to establish that they're different, right? That this is something else than what I'm doing. So a turn in Wolff's attitude towards British philosophy in general and Newtonian philosophy in particular becomes apparent soon after the publication of the Deutsche Logik in 1713. And what seems to have occasioned it is the publication of the second edition of Newton's Principia in 1713, which Wolff was asked to review for ACTA as well, or he volunteered at this point. He was prominent enough, he might pick and choose. So with this text, Newton, who Wolff usually refers to as that most profound geometer, that's kind of his usual nickname for Newton, appears to have crossed a line for Wolff by engaging in baldly metaphysical speculations that are properly the domain of the philosopher, who employs, as I said, the mathematical method, rather than the mere mathematical physicist, right? So the geometer takes a step into metaphysics, and that's where Wolff starts to become very critical of Newton. Indeed, Wolff had been wary about Newton's metaphysical ambitions for some time already. In a letter to Leibniz in 1710, Wolff registers his shock at the new queries in the Latin edition of the Optics. In that letter, he provides Leibniz with a detailed account of the doctrines Newton defends, including his claim in Query 20 in the Latin edition, that from these phenomena it is established that there is an incorporeal, living, intelligent, omnipresent being who perceives things themselves most intimately in infinite space as his sensorium, right? So Wolff just quotes that to Leibniz and says, what is going on here? And that is Leibniz's source for his knowledge of that particular aspect of of Clarke's view of Newton's view on space. Right, so it comes up for caricature and ridicule in Leibniz's letters to Clarke, but it's Wolff who first brings that to Leibniz's attention. Leibniz was, for a number of reasons, was relying on Wolff to kind of keep track of the differences, the changes in Newton's philosophy as the priority dispute unfolds. Any doubts that Wolff might have harbored about Newton's metaphysical ambitions were removed with the second edition of the Principia, which Wolff reviewed for ACTA in 1714. It's a very detailed review, and it's a very detailed catalog of all the differences between the first and the second edition. Wolff read it very carefully, right? Partly because he was reading it too for Leibniz. In his review, Wolff offers a detailed catalog of the differences with the first edition. At the conclusion of the review, he comes to the general scholium, where after noting Newton's claim not to feign hypotheses, Wolff criticizes Newton's various speculations regarding the existence and efficacy of a subtle spiritual body as little else but metaphysical hypotheses, right? So he diagnoses a kind of violation of Newton's own strictures, right? And the worry is that Newton is setting a foot into the domain of metaphysics and outside of the domain of geometry, where everybody acknowledges he's the authority. So Wolff's quibbles about Newton's forays into metaphysics might have ended there, with Wolff dismissing Newton's speculations concerning the nature of God, the non-mechanical cause of attraction, and the ether, simply as evidence of a geometrical mind unpracticed in philosophy, right? So if that's where history stopped, then Wolff would have just said, there's no point engaging with this fellow. He's obviously just he can't cut it as a philosopher. So it would have stopped there if it wasn't for the Leibniz-Clarke correspondence, or so it seems. This is a real watershed in Wolff's reception of Newtonianism. And so this is in 1717. And Wolff reviews the correspondence, the original French-English edition of 1717 in Acta in the same year. Despite his previous sympathies for Clarke that we noted, right, for Clarke's discussion of immortality, he would have seen the position Clarke now outlines in the correspondence as a direct challenge to his own, right? Even apart from his allegiance to Leibniz. Right, that's part of the point here, is that you can see already that there's a significant basis for Wolff to be worried about some of the things that Clarke says, even without considering Wolff as a dogmatic defender of Leibniz, right? So, for instance, Clarke's objection to the universal applicability of Leibniz's version of the PSR, the principle of sufficient reason, and his demand for a proof of that contentious principle threatened to undermine Wolff's own central use of that principle in his account of the mathematical method. Right, and I again talk about that in chapter 1, that Wolff, in his early logic and works on method, assigns a special role to the PSR as a necessary presupposition for the truth of theorems, which play a very important, they're kind of the engine of Wolff's mathematical method. It's where a lot of the business happens of scientific discovery. And Wolff thinks that the PSR comes in as a necessary presupposition at that point. And so the takeaway there is just that the PSR, apart from Leibniz's well-known use of it in his Metaphysics, takes up a very specific and important role for Wolff in his account of mathematical method. And so Clarke's demands of a proof and his claims that Leibniz's version of this are unfounded also affect Wolff. They also threaten what he views as his main contribution to scientific method. Yet Wolff also vigorously objected to Clarke's claim that, quote, this is from the correspondence, that mathematical reasonings can be applied to metaphysical subjects. And at the end of his review, Wolff indicates that he has come to see Clarke's, and by extension Newton's, metaphysics as a species of error in which the deliverances of the imagination are conflated with what is distinctly conceived through the intellect. Right. So here is a rare critical comment in the context of a review. Right. So Wolff writes, in the explanation of nature, mathematics alone does not suffice, without the support of the higher truth of metaphysics, to reveal the misbirths of the imagination, which are set as obstacles to the cognition of nature. Right, so mathematicians should not do metaphysics. And Wolff makes the same point later in his preface to the German edition of the correspondence, which he didn't translate. I think was it Kohler, I think, who translated those, so a disciple of Wolff. But Wolff wrote the preface to it, which reprises a number of the themes of the review as well. But this is in 1720 now. Wolff writes there, metaphysical truths are of an entirely different character than mathematical truths, such that mathematics alone is not suitable for the former. But instead, when mathematicians come to discuss metaphysical matters, they tend to chase after empty imaginings. Right? So again, we have to keep in mind the distinction between mathematics and mathematical method. Right? This is not a problem with mathematical method. This is a problem of mathematicians not going through the proper philosophical processes in forming their definitions and principles and concepts. So in this case, the images or imaginings that must be distinguished from the distinct representations supplied by the understanding are the mathematician's conceptions of, for instance, space, time, and motion. These are the particular causes of concern for Wolff. Space is the initial one, but then time and motion are implicated too. Wolff allows that these representations suffice for the purpose of the mathematician, who is only interested in determinations of quantity and magnitude. These imaginary notions of these things, right, or the notions of these things according to the imagination, suffice for all our mathematical purposes, right? And so we can't fault the mathematician in their use of these concepts in that context. But for the purposes of this use, these representations are not rendered sufficiently distinct or given accurate definitions by the mathematician. Accordingly, such notions cannot simply be imported into metaphysics without occasioning widespread error. We can talk a little bit more about what that means precisely, but Wolff here is drawing on Tyrnhaus, in fact, who has a very similar diagnosis of error in general in terms of the conflation of the representations of the imagination with those of the intellect or the understanding, which is essentially a Cartesian conception of error, right? That there's a kind of the imagination is responsible for the images that are the objects of mathematics, but metaphysics is something that is the business of the intellect. So Tyrnhaus is drawing it from Descartes and the Cartesian tradition, but Wolff is kind of giving that a Leibnizian twist as well. Right, so Wolff traces Newton's and Clarke's peculiar metaphysical claims back to their faulty definitions. Right, the reason why they get in trouble is because they make use of these indistinct notions. Right? And this results from their original failure to submit the representations on the part of the mathematical imagination to the rigorous scrutiny of the understanding. Right? So they make a kind of a factual error in terms of their specific definitions of these concepts, but that's because they fail to understand what's necessary for a true philosophical approach to these notions. And so again, in the first chapter, well, I guess I talk about this a fair bit in this chapter too, but up until this point in Wolff's development, right up until 1716 or so, he had no interest in ontology. Right, and it's strange to think when we look at the German metaphysics, we infer backwards that this is the German metaphysics opens with a very detailed discussion of ontology, and we think, well, Wolff, if anything, is an ontologist. But in fact, Wolff had been very dismissive about ontology for similar reasons as Leibniz, right? That as Leibniz was skeptical of certain scholastic approaches to metaphysics and ontology in particular. But these kind of circumstances are what convinced Wolff to think that we need an ontology. It can no longer be just an appendix to metaphysics that is for the connoisseur, but not for the metaphysician necessarily. And so this is what accounts for both Wolff's more substantive treatments of ontology in the works after 1716, and for the priority he now assigns it with respect to the other topics of metaphysics. Right? In the Ratio Praelectionum, he says, well, in my classes, I treat ontology as a kind of appendix to metaphysics. We don't start with it, right? And that's a major change from that text to the German metaphysics, where it's the first in the order of topics. So he'd gotten this far with an extremely austere ontology, but he now recognized that this extreme parsimony left the door open to confusion and error, right? He's blaming himself for where Newton goes awry and Clarke goes awry. It's because we're not doing our job as metaphysicians in explaining the concepts and principles, giving them adequate definitions and justifications, and that's why these poor benighted Newtonians are going awry. So Wolff response to this then will not just be to diagnose the error, but proactively outfit his austere ontology with a richer complement of definitions of key ontological terms. Notably, many of these have particular relevance to the debate between Leibniz and Clarke, right? Things that come up for discussion there. How do we understand space? How do we understand time? How do we understand continuity? How do we understand motion? Those are all concepts that Wolff now offers a clear definition of. In addition, principles that come up for discussion, the principle of sufficient reason, now finds a justification, right? That's what Clarke asked for. So Leibniz didn't give him. Wolff does that. Not successfully by anybody's measure, but the reason he's doing it is because he realizes that's a debt that ontology has to pay now. So only in this way, Wolff thinks, can the confusions at the root of the debate be avoided, and the philosophical errors perpetrated by Newton and Clarke, indeed the philosophical absurdities of thinking that God has a sensorium and stuff like that, these will be prevented in this way from infecting the whole of metaphysics. Okay. So it's just such a project that Wolff refers to in his Ratio Praelectionum, his account of his lecture activity in 1718. So Wolff writes there, it remains to me for me to say something concerning the emendation of first philosophy that I have attempted. I remarked above that in first philosophy, which one tends to call ontology, things in particular are lacking. I'm just moving. The two things in particular are lacking, namely distinct concepts of the general terms, the use of which is indispensable in philosophy and other disciplines, and evident propositions, in which as ultimate posits, the demonstrations of other disciplines could be resolved provided one observes the greatest rigors in proving them. Right, so one thing that should be noted here too is that for Wolff, ontology is not just a discipline for metaphysics, it's also important for physics. Right, it's important for for economics, right? It's important for all of the various subdisciplines because it takes notions like substance and cause and power and gives definitions of those that are going to be used. And in this way, actually, Wolffian ontology is something of a meta-discipline. It's not one metaphysical discipline among others. It's rather higher in stature than all the rest because it talks about the principles and concepts that all the other disciplines will be making use of. So in a way, you can compare it fruitfully with Kantian transcendental philosophy. Right, albeit with a Wolffian twist. Just got to reactivate this screen here. Okay, so the first task of an amended ontology will thus be to provide distinct concepts of the most general terms that are common to all sciences. However, Wolff acknowledges that there is a difficulty that crops up when one is considering such general concepts. Right, so in case with normal concepts, Wolff has an account of how we acquire those concepts and assure ourselves of the legitimacy of their use. Right? We have a story we can tell about how those concepts came from experience, from abstraction and reflection on that experience, right? And so some concepts, like mathematical concepts, are arbitrary. They're just we take random marks and throw them together and see if something works. But when it comes to empirical concepts, there's a story to be told about abstraction that we can show licenses their use. For mathematical concepts, it's going to be their role in geometry and things we can prove about them that ultimately is going to verify those. But when it comes to the concepts of ontology and the principles of ontology, we have an obvious problem. He writes, the problem consists in the fact that such abstract things are too far removed from intuitive cognition. And notwithstanding that they lie hidden in singular things, they are nonetheless so submerged in them that it's not for just anyone to draw them out into the light. Right? So there's a role that these concepts have in experience and the objects that we experience, but it's difficult to try and provide an account of how we acquire and what justifies our use of those concepts, focusing solely on a story of acquisition from experience. So these ontological concepts and principles pose a specific problem about demonstrating their reality. All right, so as I write here, just a reminder, the usual way of rendering our concepts distinct via abstraction and external sensation is not available in this case. So I mean, this is I think important that Wolff comes to this problem, right, at this point, because it is a version of the Kantian problem of a deduction. Right? Wolff is asking a question about what justifies the use of these concepts. So he thinks that the justification of the use of the concepts is the question of the justification of the use of these concepts is answered by providing a sufficient definition of them. But he's nonetheless worried about that problem, even if Kant would never accept that as a solution. Right? And so there's two routes for what Wolff refers to as the justification of the concepts of ontology. Right. So so the question is, how do we justify these concepts? And Wolff says, well, there's two ways that we can do it. This is at the time of the Ratio Praelectionem, so 1718. He'll think of a third one when it comes to the Deutsche Metaphysik to follow. So in response to this novel problem, which rears its head in German philosophy for the first time in this moment in Wolff's writing, Wolff outlines two distinct ways in which the concepts of ontology may be justified. That's Wolff's term, rectificandis, which is to say that we can attain a clear concept that permits of a rigorous definition. The first way is a derivation of the concept by means of a principle, and primarily by means of the PSR, which Wolff claims was inspired by the Leibniz-Clark correspondence. Right? So one way we can get at a justification of certain concepts is by showing that they follow from or amount to the principle of sufficient reason understood in some sense. Right, and because the principle itself is taken as unquestionable at this point for Wolff, right? Well, then we can rely on this as a source of an accurate definition of the concept, just showing that it has some connection to the principle of sufficient reason. So Wolff says, I saw, however, this is Wolff in the Ratio Praelectionem. I saw, however, which I then observed that Leibniz noticed in his controversy with the celebrated Englishman Clark, that the principle of sufficient reason is of much use for this. I make use of this principle in the correction or justification, rectificandis, of ontological definitions, and not merely in establishing theorems in philosophy, right? That was the original use Wolff used PSR for. Whether Leibniz made a similar use of this principle, I will not say. I have thus far not seen any of Leibniz's meditations concerning first philosophy. Right, so Wolff says that, Wolff is right. Leibniz does suggest this late in the correspondence, that it might be the case that we can get better definitions of space and time by reference to PSR, but he never spells out how. Right? But Wolff takes that as inspiration and a fruitful suggestion, and he goes on to show how certain concepts can be derived by use of the principle of sufficient reason. And I don't know if I talk about it in detail in this presentation. I don't think I do. No, I don't. And so the way in which Wolff thinks that is that there are certain concepts, like the concepts of being in itself and being in another, an attribute, right, or an accident, and a cause or an effect that can be derived, right, or just amount to different ways of expressing the principle of sufficient reason, right? That they're roughly equivalent in the case of cause and effect, right? Or that the difference between a being in itself and a being through another is whether it has a sufficient reason in itself or in something else, right? So these are concepts that gain a kind of fundamental definition in virtue of the principle of sufficient reason. So Wolff thinks that that path suffices to justify a certain set of concepts, right? But there's another set of concepts, like space and time, for instance, that aren't justified through PSR. And so Wolff turns to another way of justifying those. And in this, you'll see, I think, him being inspired by Locke in a positive way. That is a reference to inner experience. right? And that has a way of certifying some concepts. So a second route, however, does not obviously have its basis in the correspondence. This is the way of inner experience. That is, we reflect on our own ideas and their relations to the subject, to one another, and thereby derive distinct concepts of ontology. So in the Ratio Praelectionum, Wolff had identified a distinct set of notions of first philosophy that find their origin in, quote, perceptions of the human mind. And foremost among these general notions are space and time. But there's others too, like dream and waking. Those are justified or defined in accordance with an appeal to inner experience. But in the case of the concepts he's talking about here, indeed, dream and waking are there as well: extension, continuity, time, space, truth, externality, right? But time is the first one there. Wolff takes that as being the most obvious way of concept that's justified in this way. This reference to inner experience as a source of distinct concepts, particularly those of sleep, waking, and truth, obviously has a Cartesian flavor. But the alleged source in inner experience for our concept of time, through reflection on the succession of our perceptions, is also redolent of Locke's account of the acquisition of the idea of succession or duration from, quote, reflection on those appearances of several ideas, one after another in our mind, right? And if you remember the German Metaphysics, that's actually how Wolff undertakes his account of the concept of time. Right, we notice one thought following another, right, and that sets up an idea of an order among our perceptions, and that order is the basis for our concept of time. So it's not exactly the Lockean version, but it's comparable. Significantly, as indicated by the priority assigned to time in Wolff's list of concepts, this derivation serves as a model for the other ontological concepts, even if this ordering is not reflected in the presentation in the eventual Deutsche Metaphysik. Right, and so the third way that's added in the Deutsche Metaphysik is one that Wolff derives from German scholastic philosophy, from Clauberg in particular, which is appeal to the principle of contradiction. Right, and that's why Wolff adds that section too, is because he has to first certify the principle of contradiction the way he does, and then talk about the concepts like essence and necessity that follow directly, that follow directly from the principle of contradiction, or are justified with reference to it. Then he moves to the PSR and the concepts associated with that: substance, accident, causality, or power. And then he moves on to the concepts certified by inner experience. So that structuring still informs the German metaphysics, even if you have to refer to the Ratio Praelectionum to see it working its way out. Okay, so we're at the point of conclusions. The foregoing has revealed a previously unnoticed complexity and evolution in Wolff's reception of British philosophy, and Newton in particular. Wolff's early affinities with Newtonianism give way to a thoroughgoing critical attitude. The Newtonians fall prey to a sort of over-reliance on senses or the imagination, and this error is to be redressed in a newly important ontology that seeks distinct concepts and accurate definitions for use in metaphysics. It also, in the Deutsche Metaphysik in particular, seeks to certify those fundamental principles in light of which those things can be done too. Right? So Wolff realizes there's more work to do. In the end, Wolff is, of course, by no means a Newtonian, but we've seen that there is certainly more to the story of the reception of British philosophy at the dawn of the German Enlightenment. Whatever one makes of Wolff's Leibnizianism, it was not proof against any influence on the part of British thinkers on his philosophical views. And that's that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Laurie, for this very nice talk. So we can start the Q&A session. I can start with a question I had. I mean, several questions reading your paper, but I will start with one general, perhaps clarification question, which concerns the methodological aspect. Yeah. I mean, you mentioned, and I assume that it was the case while reading the paper, that the mathematical method is discussed elsewhere in the book before you come to this discussion of ontology. But so I was wondering if you could say a few words on that, and particularly what I'm interested in is the difference between, in a way, the Wolff's mathematical method on the one hand, and the mathematical method used in mathematics or in mathematical physics by Newton. I mean, and if Wolff's mathematical method, I think suggests somewhere, is more of a logic underneath some demonstration, why do we call it mathematical? Why is it mathematical method?
Yeah, so we Wolff and Tschirnhaus call it that, and that's because it's a method that's inspired by Euclid's method in the elements. Albeit with a number of kind of innovations that Wolff introduces, right? But I mean, the best answer to your question, I think, is just to talk about how narrow narrow the mathematical method is understood by Wolff, right? So I mean, it starts out with definitions and axioms, like first principles. Axioms in that case are actually derived from definitions, so they're not underivable propositions. They're actually secondary to the definitions. And then those axioms can give rise to the formulation of certain theorems, right, or problems that are then tested, right, and examined using experiment, which is something that Wolff allows in the context of the mathematical method. And that gives rise to certain true propositions that then become premises and syllogisms that allow for demonstrations, in as much as the certainty of the definitions and axioms is preserved all the way through to the stage of demonstration. Right, so I mean, I think that Wolff would say that it's a method that's not well suited for mathematics, especially when you're thinking about, algebraic reasoning. That Wolff doesn't think that there's certain areas of mathematics that applies well to, like geometry, from which it's borrowed. But there's other areas where it just wouldn't apply. And so he's against a straightforward identification. But maybe there's some other aspects of it too that maybe help to distinguish it from a mathematical application proper. Right. So one is that Wolff, so he's following on Aristotle here too, right? In the posterior analytics, we'll say things that the kind of things that can serve as first principles in a demonstration are definitions and axioms. Those are the Aristotelian first principles as well. But Wolff also says that so-called clear experiences can be included, right? And that's something really new, because, and Wolff is drawing that from Tschirnhaus, who talks about experientiae evidentes. But these are things that are known by means of experience, but once they are had, they are known with such certainty, they are known doubtlessly, that it wouldn't make sense to deny them, and so that licenses their use as first principles too. Right. So maybe on some versions of Euclid, he takes some, the parallel postulate or something as just true without any further efforts at demonstration. But that's a bit different than what Wolff means by clear experiences. These aren't just things that are presupposed or presumed. They are rather things that Wolff says we have a special insight into. Right? And so the example of this in the Deutsche Metaphysik is the proposition that that whatever is conscious exists. Whatever is conscious exists, right? Which is the first evident experience, but that's by no means the last. Wolff has other ones that he makes use of. And that's why empirical psychology is one of the initial disciplines of ontology for Wolff. It's because part of its remit is going to be gathering these clear experiences for use in other metaphysical disciplines too. Yeah. There's lots of questions one can ask about this, right? Wolff has just kind of invented a category of experiences that has this magical character, that it's self-evident and can serve as a first principle in a demonstration. But yeah, Wolff has actually a fair bit to say about it. And he does think that there's a way of certifying something as a clear experience that involves experiment, right? That actually involves appeal to actual empirical investigation. So it's not as if that this is a kind of a rational insight that we have, right? It can also be a hard-won empirical truth that it is certified on the basis of the things that we've done. And so part of it is that Wolff just has a very different kind of foundational epistemology than we're used to working in a post-Kantian way, right? Different sense of the distinction between the a posteriori and the a priori that allows him to make these sorts of claims. But yeah, that's the essence of it. So what he means by mathematical method is not the method used by mathematics, but rather a very specific sort of method that has application primarily in the sciences.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Yeah, really building on this. This was fascinating, by the way. So I'm curious, like related to Marco's question, I'm curious then if Wolff had this divide between proper mathematical method and what the mathematicians are doing.
Yeah.
Then what is it exactly that the mathematicians are doing wrong in such a way?
Yeah.
The imagination starts basically playing tricks on them to make causing them to error.
Yeah.
To make errors. I mean, what specifically in their usage of
yeah, so qua mathematicians, they're doing nothing wrong, right? But when they start drawing philosophical conclusions using the concepts that they've developed and applied in mathematics, that's when Wolff thinks that they run into error, right? And so they're making use of a concept of space, right? That is drawn ultimately from the senses, right? So just very kind of simplistic view of this would be like, well, space is a kind of as an empty box, right? That's a kind of conception of space we can arrive at through the imagination by taking a given sensation, external sensation, and just removing all the content from it. And we think of space as just kind of an empty, an empty container, right? And that for Wolff is similar to the way the Newtonians conceive of it. And Wolff says that one can have such a conception of space and it can do certain work for you successfully in physics and mathematics. But when you start reflecting on that as a kind of ontological notion, wondering about its relation to God, is it co-eternal with God? Or that would be absurd because of what we know about God. It has to be something that's connected to God in some way, right? Well, maybe it's related to God in the same way that it's related to us, that it's a kind of way that we sense things, right? And so we'll call it a divine sensorium, right? And so this is how Wolff thinks, this is the haphazard method that Wolff thinks Newtonian metaphysicians are working in. They take this concept that's good enough for the mathematical application, and then they plug it into metaphysical considerations, and everything looks strange, right? Then you end up with this absurdity that God has a kind of faculty of sensibility. What consequences does that have for the views of the human soul and also views of God, right? I mean, what does that do for natural theology? What mistakes does it inject into that discipline, right? So they also don't have a sense of just kind of the way in which metaphysics is interconnected, that Wolff also thinks can lead them into error, yeah, and make them inattentive when they do fall into error.
If I can follow up, so the problem is not necessarily that they reify certain concepts like absolute space. The problem is that they don't do it the right way.
That's right.
Which would be like PSR or contradiction or something like that.
Yeah, I don't go into detail, and I mean, Wolff only has a paragraph on this whole rectificandus stuff, right? So it's not like he gives us a lot of detail on it. He just gives us a very kind of quick outline. But if we take the German metaphysics exposition of that as kind of what's realized through that, then we can kind of see what Wolff has in mind. But that's right. It's not just a reification or hypostatization of space that he's worried about. It's rather that their definition is not up to it hasn't secured its philosophical or metaphysical bona fides yet, right? And so what they need to do is they need to draw a precise definition of space as a result of that. And Wolff thinks that's going to end up with the Leibnizian relational conception of space. That space is a kind of order of coexistence, right? And so that's very different than what Wolff takes the mathematical conception of space to be as a kind of absolute container or something like that. Yeah.
Shall I go? Thank you so much for your input. Really good. And thank you for pointing attention that Wolff didn't know the British empiricist and so. And I just tell you there is a turning point. And then I would like to ask you about the concept of inner experience, because then if I'm not wrong, so you said, well, it's slightly influenced by Locke. Yeah. So after this turning point, it would still return to a Lockean pattern. Yeah. And okay, so do you have any more evidence for this? I would have a suggestion, namely that this kind of inner experience to gain the justification from a metaphysical concept, that's purely Leibniz.
Of the new essays.
No,
okay.
That's the point. That's in Monadology 30, which was not published at the time because it was only published in translation in 1720. But Wolff did have a copy of Monadology through Heinrich Köhler, his student. Yeah. So it was the only guy on this planet to know about this at the time. Well, one of the 2 or 3 guys to know about it. So when I look at the quote, it reminds me pretty much of Leibniz. So. I would love to know whether it's really a kind of Lockean pattern or not.
Yeah, so let me show you the version of this presentation that I did in Mainz for a
there is the answer.
Yeah, so for a conference on Locke's reception in 18th century German philosophy, you'll see it has a similar title to this one. In that case, I was talking about Newton, but mostly talking about Locke. In this case, I'm talking about Newton, but less about Locke. But we can see that Wolff actually has some rather surprising things to say about Locke. Let's see where it is. You'll see some of the same content recycled because I'm anything if not efficient. There we are. So let's just go through this actually, if you have patience. Is that okay if I just walk through this bit of the presentation? Yeah, okay. So here's his, so again, a similar case with Locke as with Newton, is that the site of the influence is in his very early works. So it's quite certain that Wolff read Locke's essay and indeed that he read it before 1705. So with the translation by, I think the Latin translation actually. Since in a letter to Leibniz from early 1705, he lists Locke among a number of philosophers who particularly influenced his views on logic. So there he says in the Latin that in philosophy and in particular in rational, right, there's the illustrious Tschirnhaus and Malebranche, oddly, who always gets identified as a logician in the period, even by Kant, and Locke, of course, was an influence here too. I just have to move all the faces out of the way again because they're interfering with my, yeah, Locchio, there he is. This would appear to be a reference to the essay, right? It's hard to know what work of Locke he was referring to, but it's too early for the essay on the conduct of the understanding, which Wolff also really liked. And the date would suggest that Wolff would have read either the French translation by Coste in 1700 or the Latin translation by Burridge, which was published in London in 1701. And as I mentioned today, Wolff taught himself free English over the summer of 1705 in response to Menke's invitation. Let's see. So let me, don't worry about that. These are certain aspects that would have appealed to, of Locke's philosophy that would have appealed to Wolff given some of his early publications. So there's reasons why he would have been attracted to Locke and seen somebody who was saying some of the same things. But after 1705, Wolff comes to think differently on some issues that he appeared to share with Locke. But he did remain interested in Locke, and he wrote 2 reviews of 2 posthumously published works for ACTA in the next few years. So he wrote a review of Locke's posthumous works, which were published in 1706, and which contained the essay of the conduct of the understanding. Wolff approvingly, in that review, notes Locke's recommendation of the study of mathematics and his assertion that every single argument should be managed as a mathematical demonstration. Right, so Locke talks about the importance of mathematics as a way of training the understanding, and Wolff was all over that. He loved that. And he frequently refers to Locke positively in this respect in other texts later. And I say here that this is arguably the Lockean text that has the most influence on Wolff, the one that he read most carefully. But second is a collection of Locke's correspondence, some familiar letters between Mr. Locke and several of his friends. This is from 1708. But Wolff notes a few key points of difference with Locke in this review. So it contained a letter from Leibniz to Locke that included initial and sometimes obscure critical reflections on the essay, but which were summarily dismissed by Locke and Molyneux. Wolff, however, determined that Leibniz's thoughts did not receive a fair hearing, and accordingly he reproduced the reflections in their first Latin translation in his review. Right, so Locke and Molyneux have this kind of dismissive exchange about Leibniz, this weird German guy who's writing them letters. They don't want to talk about him. They think they read some of his works and they're like, this is ridiculous, which is a common reaction when reading Leibniz's works, present company excluded. But Wolff says, well, there's more to say here. And he translates all of their comments and then offers a response in acta. And yeah, let's not worry about the specifics there. But in the end, Wolff's admiration for Locke survives these differences, as he would later write in the preface to the first edition of the German Logic, which you're no doubt familiar with this quote. In our land, one takes Locke's work on human understanding for uncommonly sensible throughout, so that even those who despise all of his countrymen nonetheless hold him in high esteem. Yeah. So I think that Wolff's reception of Locke, as opposed to that of Newton, is largely wholly positive. They move away on certain issues, such as the utility of the syllogism and scientific investigation, but that's because of Leibniz's influence. But on the whole, I think Locke actually exercises a very positive influence on Wolff. So on the specific question about the way of inner experience, right? It could be from Leibniz, but it seems to be more natural to think that this is part of the whole effect of Locke on Wolff's thinking at this important time. And the point isn't in the end that these aren't for Wolff. You have to pick one or the other, right? It's not as if he feels like you can't be both, right? So it could be the case that when he sees that in the monadology later, he thinks, well, this is what Locke was doing too. And I like that, right? So it's not as if it has to be either or.
Can I have a very, very quick
For sure, yes. And then we have
I was also thinking of Descartes as a
Yeah.
coming for.
Yeah. For this inner experience stuff?
Is I think also a paradigm example.
Yeah.
Of something that is indubitably given.
Yeah. I mean, in this case, so Wolff might very well have, made that connection of himself. But for Tschirnhaus and the Medicina Mentis, his example of a evident experience is just the cogito. Yeah. So that specifically frames it in the context of the mathematical method as a clear experience.
So thank you. We have a question from Boris online. So please, Boris, go ahead.
Yeah, I had can you hear me all right?
Yep.
Okay, good. I had a couple of questions about the explicit references to authors such as Locke, and actually I want to follow up on what you just said. You mentioned something about the anti-syllogistic aspect in early Wolff. Does Wolff explicitly refer to Locke in that context? Because I would say it's not exclusive to Locke. You can find it in Descartes, you can find it in the Port Royal Logique, this anti-syllogism. Well, I would say what is original in Locke is his use of it to attack innate ideas and general principles, right? So here the question is, I'll just start with that quick follow-up. Does he explicitly frame it with Locke in mind, or is it just a general?
Good. So yeah, my suggestion in that presentation, which I didn't review in advance of today, but I just remembered it in light of the questions, is that that's just one point of potential commonality between the two.
Okay.
Right. And indeed, another point of commonality is their suspicion about essences and our capacity to know essences, which comes out in Wolff's early treatise De Loquela, where Wolff also defends occasionalism, in fact. So it's a very early treatise, one that he sends Leibniz, and it provokes Leibniz on these 2 points. Right. First of all, you're wrong about essences. Those don't have their origin in the divine will. They have their origin in the divine understanding. And secondly, you're wrong about the syllogism too. It is a tool for discovery. That's all. Leibniz just says that, and then Wolff says, "Oh, okay, sorry," and changes his mind. Right. So the point isn't that. So I don't know that he gets it from Locke, but it's initial point of contact between the two that might have made the early Wolff sympathetic to Locke. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And then, if I may, very briefly, I read the chapter in preparation, and there's at some point you make an interesting, you refer to an interesting criticism that Wolff had of a proof for the existence of God, which he believes to be a formal fallacy. I also believe that, and I'm wondering whether he refers to anyone in particular. I think it occurs in the Timaeus, but the most famous version of it that I know of, and the most clearly fallacious version, is the one from Locke in the 4th book of the essay. So the proof goes something like this, right? Everything that exists contingently, so to speak, must exist for a cause. Hence, there must be something of which it is the case that it has no cause. That is, I haven't figured it out, but there's something wrong with the scope of the necessity operator there, or something like that, or so there's something wrong logically there. But Locke explicitly makes that inference. Does he explicitly refer to Locke, or is it just a general?
Yeah, I don't think he refers to Locke. And my feeling is that the longer, the further you go through the essay, the more Wolff agrees with Locke, and that the 4th book, I think, Wolff largely finds sympathetic, at least if you compare it with the Deutsche Logik and the discussion there of signs and of the kind of the topics that will come up in Locke's 4th book of the essay. But on that specific proof, so the ratio praelectionum is where we actually get a very detailed account of the errors of previous attempts to prove God's existence. And it's a text that, for that reason, first put Wolff on the radar of the pietists in Halle, because Wolff doesn't go on to provide his own proof. He says, here are the problems with the 4 traditional proofs, and he says maybe a better one can be presented, but then he just moves on to a different topic. So the one that he offers in the Deutsche Metaphysics is presumably intended to redress the problems, but the fact that he had such a putatively agnostic, kind of inconclusive discussion of proofs of God's existence in the ratio praelectionum is first what made the pietists get their eyebrows up and say, this guy's up to something. And so I should say too that in terms of, if you're looking for particular sources, I'd recommend that you look at essays by Robert Thijs and Matteo Favoretti. So the latter in particular has an excellent essay called Der Psychotheologische Weg, which looks at one of the kinds of proof, the proof that Wolff ultimately ends up deciding on, but contrasts that with some of the criticisms of previous proofs in the ratio praelectionum. And Robert Thijs has a number of essays on this. I can't remember the specific one, but he does have a detailed discussion of the diagnosis of the errors of previous proofs of God's existence, which, by the way, is obviously another point of contact between Wolff and Kant, right? And another thing that you don't see if you don't read texts before the Deutsche Metaphysik is that in the Ratio Praelectionum, Wolff has a number of interesting moments where he says, here are the difficulties in proving God's existence. Here are the problems with the pre-established harmony. There's a long section of that in the Ratio Praelectionum too. And so that's why it's a useful text, I think, that provides an interesting and contrasting lens on the German metaphysics when you read it as well. But I should note too, just for the connoisseurs in the crowd, that there's two editions of the Ratio Praelectionum. The first edition, and then the Ohms edition reproduces the second edition of the 1730s. And Wolff there makes a lot of changes to the first edition of the text to reflect the changes in his philosophical thinking in the interim, right? And so if you're really interested in Wolff's early views on these things, rather than his later reflections on these same topics, you have to look at the first edition of 1718. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Is there any other?
Sorry, did that answer your question, Boris? Just want to make sure that you're muted though.
Sorry, no, yeah, I was trying to avoid echo. Yeah, thanks. That's very helpful.
I think he had further questions, yes, but
Boris, if you have other,
or correspondent.
No.
Boris, if you want to go ahead with your other questions, feel free to do so. Otherwise, I think it's fine. Casper, please.
What I was thinking about now, about wait, so I kept making more arrows and lines. Okay, didn't make it more easy to understand. So if I, to kind of recap for myself, because I'm not really familiar with Wolff. So the ontology for him has the two purposes of providing clear concepts, and then propositions with those concepts that kind of work like axioms for specific sciences later. And then these
very high level ones, right? Each specific science can have their own definitions and axioms that are only made use of within the context of that science.
Right,
construed. But there are some that apply to all, right? Concepts like essence that will come up in a number of sciences. And so no individual science has the sole responsibility of unfolding that concept, right? And so, yeah, it's a high level account of the basic concepts and principles of cognition.
Right.
Yeah.
And then you were talking about how these concepts can be justified.
That's right. Wolff comes to see that there's a particular problem with the justification of this set of concepts and principles.
And so the way I see it, that he, from this text, so that there are like the three ways of doing that is using the principle of sufficient reason, the non-contradiction principle, and then the inner experience as the third one.
That's right.
The second one you used. And I was thinking about what the connection is with innate ideas, because I can imagine like those principles, like the principle of sufficient reason, to be considered something like an innate idea. It's some kind of like logical principle. But as soon as you start talking about experiences, it is different, of course, than an innate idea, but then it's inner experiences.
That's right.
So I was just wondering what the connection was.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, so one thing I want to make clear, though, is that this isn't an error you made, but just for the reference of everybody else, is that idea of ontology as serving that purpose and doing those things is an idea of ontology that Wolff has from the very beginning. He just thought it had a very narrow remit before, that it didn't have to do too much of that. But as he develops through the 1700s and the 1710s, he starts to realize there's more work for ontology to do, more principles that have a justification that might be challenged. And so in the full dress version of this, in the German Metaphysics, right, he says, well, we're not just going to drive this from PSR, we're going to prove PSR too. We're not just going to drive these concepts from PNC, we have to prove or certify PNC too. Right. And then so inner experience serves a similar role. But so Wolff comes to think of different ways of doing this, of serving this task of justification. But the basic idea is there in his amended ontology from the beginning. So yeah, on the question of innate ideas, Wolff is, as he often is, just kind of he's a principled agnostic about them. He doesn't see a reason to affirm or deny them. He doesn't think that it's an important issue to settle for the sake of metaphysics. And partly this is because of how different he is in terms of his views of a priority. He doesn't, that's really tied to innate ideas. And so he doesn't really take a consistent stand on it. So there's some places where he seems to show sympathy to it, like there's a passage in the Anmerkungen, the kind of commentary on the German metaphysics, where he suggests that he has a kind of sympathy with the school of Plato and their doctrine of ideas. But then there's other places where he says that all ideas are acquired in some way. Right. So I just think it's not, I mean, as with many cases, like Leibniz's monadology, it's something that is possible, but show me that it matters, and then I'll have an opinion on it. That's kind of Wolff's principled stance on these kinds of things. Yeah.
Great, thanks.
Yeah.
Please, Karin.
Yeah, I have a small question concerning Wolff's use of the principle of sufficient reason to derive ontological concepts. Because I didn't really understand why it was actually a use of the principle of sufficient reason.
Yeah.
Because he's basically saying, well, either something has a reason within itself, or has its
Right.
reason within itself, or the reason why it is what it is internal or is not internal.
Yeah.
So he operates with the binary distinction. But I think that in this case, the question, what is the reason or ground of something,
Yes,
is a question that is being asked
that's right.
and could be asked, in the same way as many other questions could be asked. Because the principle of division is more like the assumption that all that there are only two possibilities, just two contraries.
Yeah.
That a disjunction is an exhaustive disjunction.
That's right.
And so I thought it was a bit misleading, maybe on Wolff's part, to.
No, it's misleading on my part. I mean, Wolff doesn't say much about it, and I was speaking in a kind of speaking loosely. The kind of the part you can hold me to is if I say that in here, in the chapter itself. I mean, I think that what you're saying is exactly correct. I mean, the way in terms of a use of PSR, Wolff will talk about that in the truth of theorems, right? We can see that a theorem which posits a cause for a given effect, that a theorem is true in light of the principle of sufficient reason, right? That there has to be some such cause. But you're right. This is more kind of a rational reflection on the PSR. And we see that there's a kind of limited number of possibilities for what kind of reasons things can have. And so it's a bit of a higher level kind of reflection on this. So that's perfectly correct, I think.
But what I find interesting is the fact that many philosophers, including Kant, operate or create, let's say, systems, concepts, by assuming that by means of binary division, you
in Kant's case, trinary division.
But is there a name for the principle according to which all divisions that we can make, at the level of concepts, are exhaustive disjunctions?
Yeah. I mean, principle of excluded middle, right? Would be one, but I mean, that's just, that's not one. I mean, Wolff just takes that as obvious. I mean, because Kant has a view of disjunction where a proper disjunction is one that exhausts the entire scope of possibilities. Yeah. So that's just their privilege, their preferred kind of disjunction, I guess.
But do they have a justification for the principle of the
right? So you want even more from Wolff on this, then, right? How do we justify the principle of excluded middle?
Also, like freely producing these totalities or systems simply by binary division.
Yeah.
And claiming that everything is covered.
Yeah.
I find the result kind of convincing, but do they have a justification for the fact that they operate in this manner? Yeah,
they don't. I mean, so I in the question about Wolff is I don't know. Maybe in his Latin logic, there might be some discussion of the principle of excluded middle. My sense, though, there's probably people here who are better positioned to answer this in general than I am, is that they take it as kind of a presupposition of syllogistic reasoning, right? That it only works when we're dealing with classes that are exclusive, right? Certain kinds of reasoning. And so that the principle of excluded middle goes along with the dicto de omni et nullo, right? And that certain kind of chains of reasoning only work by assuming kind of iterative exclusions, right?
Yeah, but creating divisions by means of you know opposing two options is much simpler than types of syllogistic reasoning. Yes, it's possible that the principle of the excluded middle applies to both, but yeah, it seems to me that in this case it doesn't require any syllogistic inferencing.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know if you have something to say.
The video had a follow-up.
Yeah, I mean, this works in case of contradictions, right? So you have to have so something either is or is not. And basically that's also an instance of the law of excluded middle. But my question was like, very in line with this. I'm wondering if, so for Aristotle has a justification for non-contradiction. And a separate justification for excluded middle, right?
Yeah.
He doesn't complete it. I'm wondering how is it for Wolff? Is he kind of taking it that, you know, accepting a law of non-contradiction automatically entails excluded middle?
Yeah.
Or can you have like something which is true and false at the same time?
Yeah, so I do have discussion
Is
of.
there any third way?
I don't think I have it in this chapter. Maybe I do. Do I have discussion of Wolff's certification of principle of contradiction? Actually, I think I do. It's in the final section, part A, the principle of contradiction. So, but that doesn't. I don't think that addresses your question, but it gives some specifics about my reading of Wolff's certification of that principle, which has often been just dismissed outright as a kind of psychologistic defense of the principle of contradiction. So I think it's something different. And I make a case for it there. But in response to your question, I think Wolff's proof of the principle of contradiction or certification of it does not constitute a proof of the principle of excluded middle. But I'm pretty sure he thinks it comes with it. So, but I would look to the Latin logic to see if he has any other discussions of it there. But at least in the case, I think he presupposes it. He thinks they come together as a package, but the proof only works for the principle of contradiction. It seems to presuppose the principle of excluded middle.
We have a question from Boris, or was it just a mistake?
No, I mean, I was just following up on the justification or cause of this idea that we can characterize everything through binary divisions, right? And I think Ovidio mentioned something about Aristotle there. I think it also goes back a long way in our tradition and Porphyry, for instance, right? And the assumption is more like the point being that there's an assumption that every entity, if properly defined according to its essence, has one and only one specific difference, right? And then the contrast class are all those things which lack that specific difference. So it's not just the contradictory of a given trait is not just is the absence of it or the exclusion of it, right? Otherwise, or the set of all its contraries. That's kind of the idea. So that's, I guess, and there's a fixed idea in this tradition that there's only one right way of defining things, and that's the way that makes such kind of a binary division work out. Right? Famously, when Plato asks, like, why is man not a featherless biped? Right, that is because somehow something has gone wrong. You're not defining him according to his essence. So I think the root cause is systematically that if something really has a distinct essence, there is some one core property that makes it have that essence and that it sets it apart from everything else. Now, of course, the question you can have is to what extent are our early modern authors still entitled to that? I think that's a legitimate question, right? Whether Wolff and Kant, etc., can still talk as if that's a purely logical fact and not one that has a metaphysical root. That in a metaphysics they don't agree with. I mean, it was just a follow-up, I guess, on Karin's question. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I really can't go beyond saying That all sounds fine to me. But I know where I'd look for to find out what Wolff's view on this is, but I don't have that reference handy, unfortunately.
I have a question which is not strictly related, but that has to do with the section on the principle of contradiction in your chapter. So at a certain point, so you don't want to reduce Wolff's justification to a psychological incapability, but, and I quote, draw attention to a deeper metaphysical impossibility, namely of my having or being in two contrary states at the same time.
That's right.
Sorry,
so-
which sorry.
Yeah, it's page 73, the first paragraph. But then a bit later, you give this quote, which is interesting, and I found it a bit puzzling when I read it on the next page, where Wolff says, accordingly, that is impossible, which contains something contradictory within it, such as, for instance, an iron wood. But I was expecting something. I mean, iron and wood are, I mean, as I see them, like empirical determinations.
They are,
and then.
Well, so that's not the proof of the principle.
No,
that's an
but
implication
but
of it.
a sort of illustration example.
Yeah, which is the standard one, I think, from like logic textbooks. They talk about iron wood as a kind of standard contradiction in terms. Yeah. So Wolff isn't saying anything new there, right? Or like a wet fire or something like that.
No, but I mean, it struck me as looked more like an empirical, not psychological, but more empirical rather than two metaphysical states.
Yeah,
like
I mean,
something fundamental,
Yeah. Right. Which is, I think maybe we overestimate the extent to which Wolff is kind of tied a metaphysician first, right? I mean, what I'm saying about his ontology is that it's very much tied to its, a service it renders to particular sciences. So the only reason we should do ontology is because we want to do other sciences, right? So Wolff is, when it comes to his kind of just fundamental orientation, it's always toward on-the-ground investigation, right? So we shouldn't be surprised by his use of such empirical seeming examples.
Okay.
Though again, I don't think this is one of those necessarily this stock example whenever philosophers, logicians are talking about contradictory things, ironwood. I can't remember the Latin that they usually use, but that's one of their usual examples. But this is an example then of Wolff taking the principle of contradiction, which I claim he demonstrates in a metaphysical fashion, that it's not about my ability to conceive of something contrary to facts, that is my not being conscious of what I'm thinking about, but rather him trying to put us in the position of having a state and its contrary at the same time, right? That insofar as I'm thinking, right, I cannot then also think that I am not thinking, right? And the point is not that there's a psychological impossibility he's drawing attention to, but he's trying to make us conceive of a state where we have property A and not A. And so there's a metaphysical claim that he's making at the basis of his certification of PNC. But once that's the case, if we allow that that's how he demonstrates the principle, then he says, well, if that's the principle, then we can go on to provide a definition of possibility in light of that principle, which is something that lacks any internal inconsistency. Right. So again, this is not a use of that principle, but it's a kind of reflection on the basis of the principle that yields a concept, a very important concept for metaphysics, for ontology, namely that of possibility, because that also gives us the concept of a thing. Right. And then that gives us a concept of necessary, of essence, and all of that stuff. Yeah.
Thank you.
So that's a nice example of just how I take the process to work and how it's kind of working behind the scenes in the Deutsche Metaphysik as well.
Is there any question? Yeah.
Just so at the beginning, you were saying how kind of disputed with Newtonian disputed with him
With Keel.
Yeah, on the vacuum stuff.
Yeah.
And I was wondering how much did he go into these kinds of particulars? Because at that point, it seemed like, Wolff's whole problem was specifically a natural philosophical
It was, yeah.
with the concept
It
of
definitely was.
absolute state
Yeah.
or vacuum.
The possibility of a vacuum, yeah.
Right. How much of the weight of the whole thing was into the particular stuff, like, specific densities, I don't know, very, very more empirical.
Yeah, it was not at all a metaphysical discussion. The fact that metaphysics, as I point out in that part of the chapter, the fact that metaphysical considerations get introduced into that debate, the introduction of the principle of sufficient reason, is not because of Wolff, it's because of Leibniz. Because Leibniz wrote in a letter to Wolff after Keel's response, he said, well, here's what you're going to say to Keel. And that's when the principle of sufficient reason gets mentioned in Wolff's corpus for the first time, is because Leibniz tells him to include it. But it doesn't make sense for Wolff at that time. There's no other purpose it serves for him. So for Wolff, that was strictly a scientific debate. It was Leibniz who said that metaphysical issues turn the balance in his favor. Yeah, the principle of sufficient reason in particular. Yeah, it's an interesting case, but if you look at the correspondence between Leibniz and Wolff, there's especially concerning the priority dispute and just the debates with Newtonians, there's a lot of places where Leibniz is writing Wolff's responses for him. Right, and you can see whole passages of letter that are just reproduced almost verbatim in Wolff's eventual response. Yeah, which is not to say that Wolff doesn't contribute to it too. I mean, he has his other considerations, but the core of these arguments tend to be Leibniz's. But yeah, but I think it's important to note that this wasn't a debate for Wolff that essentially involves metaphysics in any way. And I don't think that Wolff probably thought that introducing metaphysical considerations would be helpful. Certainly when Leibniz, for instance, presents his own suggests that his monadology might be relevant to some things that Wolff is talking about. Wolff just says, he literally says, we have differences on this matter that it would take too long to explain, and I just don't see where this would be helpful for what I'm trying to do, right? So Wolff doesn't understand why we have to posit some sort of fundamental primary power in some things primary force from which its derivative forces proceed. He thinks that it's a step into metaphysics that's wholly unnecessary and unjustified from the perspective of science. Yeah. It's funny because Wolff's correspondence with Leibniz tends to be read by Leibnizians. And if you read the edition of it, I can't remember the scholar offhand, the Leibniz scholar who edited them. It's been a long week, so I can't remember the book off the top of my head, but he's a devout Leibnizian who he loves to point out these passages where Wolff is just cribbing Leibniz in later publications. But his kind of editorial perspective is that Wolff is just Leibniz's follower. And so it's a very hostile presentation of Wolff's letters. But if you consider, if you don't consider Wolff's philosophy outside of this narrow set of texts, then you're going to overemphasize Leibniz's impact on Wolff. Yeah. But there's just some things that Wolff was happy to concede to Leibniz because it didn't matter to him, one way or the other.
I know you had a question.
Yes, if I may, it's only a clarification question about the status of ontology as a first science or not.
Yeah.
And it's on your page 57. So I can just read the second paragraph. While this might seem a modest sort of obligation, in fact, it reflects a rather dramatic revision of the status and priority of first philosophy with respect to other sciences that ontologists apply the basic concepts and principles. For these other disciplines, is not a reflection of its preeminence with respect to them, rather a function of the fact that its content is derived from what they treat, so that ontology for Wolff at this stage could not be correctly pursued the whole.
Yeah.
And so my clarification is that what you claim is that ontology, that as science is so to speak developed after the sciences, it does not challenge its status as a prior science, so that it is so to speak. So my question is about what you mean by derived, because if you say that you've got Grundbegriffe,
right,
from which the others are derived.
Yeah.
So that was my clarification about the derivation status.
Yeah, so I mean, this is an early stage in development of ontology for Wolff, right? So this is before the Clark correspondence, before the Ratio Praelectionum. This is primarily his view of the discipline in the Elementa Aerometriae. So yeah, it's in one sense, Wolff will allow that specific concepts made use of in sciences and principles might be derived from, in the sense that you're talking about, from the presentation of those concepts and principles in ontology. So that's true. So I agree with you what you say. But I think more importantly is the fact that we are only concerned with those concepts and principles in as much as they are required for the prosecution of certain sciences. Right? So it's not just a kind of barbaric, not a kind of lexicon of any sort of concepts and principles for philosophy as such, as the scholastics might have conceived of it. Its content is derived from the actions, the investigations of particular sciences, right? And noticing as a philosopher that physics is talking about force, psychology is talking about force. Maybe we need to have a unifying concept that under which both of those fall, right? So there's a sense in which the treatment that ontology even considers those concepts and principles important is derived from their already underway application in those specific sciences, right? Or a principle comes up, like talking about relation of cause and effect that is made use of in a variety of sciences. Well, where do we talk about that principle in general? Which science? Well, none in particular. Let's talk about it in some general discipline, then call it ontology. That's where we'll mention that principle, right? So you can see that there's a kind of, even though there might be a kind of priority in the sense you're talking about between ontology and the specific sciences, the real important dependence is the other way around, right? And this is similar, again, I think, to Kant, right? Is that we don't have an ontology that we then, pursue into other kinds of scientific investigations, right? But rather we have a kind of, we have a need for certification of certain principles and concepts because they're important for other investigations, other sciences. So whether you think that's true about Kant or not doesn't matter. That's what I take Wolff to be saying. Does that make sense?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
I have a follow-up question. Maybe like Arnaud, I have my doubts about the term derivation. I think it's a very strong term, which would normally be used for deriving certain specific principles from a grounding principle or even from inner experience or whatever. And I think that the observation of how the concept of force is used in various disciplines can play a role, but cannot be decisive. I do not know, Wolff's early consideration, but I would be surprised if I'm not sure if Wolff actually uses the term derivation.
No, he doesn't. I mean, and you can't, it's hard to tell because there's so little on ontology in this very early period.
Yes, but it seems to me that also in relation to Kant and later post-Kantian philosopher, seems to me that that evidently one has to be aware of how certain concepts are being used in a particular context.
Yeah.
But then the ambition to write a systematic account of a set of concepts requires that all of them are derived from something, from a first principle or a very limited set of principles, and not from a consideration of their actual use.
Sure.
So that is very clear in the case of Kant.
Yeah.
And as said, I would be surprised if this were very different in the case of Wolff. Yeah, because he'd have to be very much on the Lockean side to deviate from that methodology.
So I might be misunderstanding, but here's my shot at a response, but you can tell me if I've missed the point. Right, so first of all, I mean, we should note that what I'm saying here is that the content of ontology is derived from other sciences.
Yeah, but that I think.
And so I think that's a licit use of derivation. So I'm not talking about the derivation of concepts or principles from other concepts, but rather that ontology has the specific set of concepts it does because of what other sciences are doing. Right, so I think that's an okay, not misleading use of derivation there. You're right to say that when we're talking later on, when we're looking at the doctrine of the ratio praelectionem and derivation from PSR and from inner experience, that's a misleading use of the term there. I don't think I talk about it there, but but another point is also about just the perspective I have here. So if I was trying to say that this is a kind of anticipation of Kant, right, which I don't say here really. I might want to disambiguate what Wolff is doing in terms of this is a metaphysical versus a transcendental deduction. That Wolff's demonstration of a systematic set of concepts is different than Kant's and inferior in certain ways. I think those are things that I would concede. But so there's so I mean all the Kantian speculation I'm engaging in today is really not something that I think I include in the chapter itself. So yeah, but also I think that we're looking at, when Wolff is talking about the justification of these concepts, he's saying something very new in the German context, and he doesn't spend a lot of time talking about it. And so it's difficult to disambiguate what he's talking about there. So it's a lot of speculation on my part, I guess, is what I'm saying. So yeah, that's my initial reaction, I guess, is that in the first case, this case of derivation, I don't think it's used in an illicit way. In the second case, there are certain questions that would come into play if we are particularly interested in the Kantian development after Wolff on this. I think there's an important way in which Wolff is doing something new that Kant is also going to do later on. But you're quite right that this falls short of the kind of standards that Kant is going to set for his own investigation. Wolff doesn't pretend to systematicity either, right? That's a concern that Kant injects into the discussion. Wolff doesn't say this is all of the concepts. It's open-ended. We could have more, right? Depending on what sciences do, right? What concepts are made use of there. So it's not as if Wolff is saying that this is a systematic, that this shows that this is all and only the concepts of ontology and all and only the principles of ontology. So that's an area where Kant and Wolff differ, I think, in terms of the desiderata.
Can I try to reformulate my point? So abstracting from Kant, yes,
Yeah.
as far as possible. It seems to me that in the way you explain it, there is still a tension between Wolff's or the role Wolff grants to the actual use of concepts in actual disciplines, as we can observe it, and on the other hand, his own idea of the mathematical method, where we start from as little as possible and derive results, that is to say, in this case, specific concepts, from as little as possible.
Right. Good.
Yeah. So how do you see the relationship between these two?
Well, so okay, now I see where the Lockean stuff comes in, because you're worried about the role that observation is playing in terms of our observation of what's going on in sciences,
Yes.
and how that informs what the content of ontology.
But
I see now.
specifically, how isn't that in tension with the, let's say, more rationalist ambition of deriving content?
No, that's good. So that's not what I think is going on. And you're right that if that was Wolff's story, then that would be in tension with the mathematical method. But one vital thing to note is that the ontology of the German metaphysics is not written in accordance with the mathematical method. Because ontology for Wolff at that stage is not a science. It's something else, right? We think it's a science because it is followed by a number of metaphysical sciences, but Wolff doesn't take it to be one among them, right? What it is, it's a kind of instruction manual that we make use of, right? It's a kind of debugging guide for when things come up and we're wondering about relations between sciences, concepts and principles in sciences, right? Or we're wondering about the justification of certain principles that sciences are going to make use of. Well, Wolff is going to say, we're doing something then that is not scientific. We're doing something else. And that none of the results of ontology affect the workings of the science, which are all prosecuted according to the mathematical method. But for those who have questions about what this concept has to do with that other concept, or why we can presuppose this principle in this context, that's when you have to take a step back and put on your ontology hat and ask these questions. But it's not a science. And it's not, so in the Latin version, the title of the ontology talks about demonstrated through the scientific method. But in the case of the Deutsche Metaphysik, that ontology is not labeled as scientific. It's something else. So yeah, you're right. If it was that sort of way in which Wolff acquired these concepts, then that would raise fundamental questions about his methodology. But ontology is something else. So when we just run into a cul-de-sac in the sciences or something like that, an individual science, then we want to take a step back and look at ontology and see what we're doing there.
Thank you very much. That was helpful.
Good. Yeah, no, it took me a second to put my finger on what the concern was, but yeah. Yeah, and part of this too is just how odd Wolff's treatment of ontology is. I mean, he really takes serious this Leibnizian. So that paper of Leibniz's of 1698 on De Emendazione Prima Philosophia is one that Wolff really influenced him. But he took the idea and he ran with it, right? And he has a very specific and non-Leibnizian view of emended ontology. And for me, it's important to see that that's not just a kind of childhood preoccupation for Wolff, but that it's something that survives through to the German metaphysics as well. And that the German metaphysics, the ontology of that, while pretty elaborate and extravagant in places, is still, right, it still accords to the ideal of an amended ontology for Wolff, precisely because of the way it conceives of the relation between ontology and specific sciences, including metaphysics. Yeah.
Is there any other? Oh, Marie, please.
You're muted though.
Muted.
Now it's on. Now you
Yep.
hear me. Yeah. Okay, so I have a small question just of clarification. There's one point which I found quite striking, and it's about the criticism of Wolff of Newton's and Clarke's metaphysics and the way mathematicians tend to chase after empty imaginations when they do metaphysics. And well, which I find quite funny is that critics is later addressed to Descartes' physics by Voltaire, for example, and thereby opposing to Newton's physics, which is considered mathematical, as opposed to Descartes' physics, which is considered to be imaginative, according to him. And so we could say, in the case of Descartes, that his physics, in a way, is imaginative in the way that he uses the imagination as a faculty, a mathematical faculty of representing figures in space.
Yeah.
And so my question is, when Wolff criticizes Newton and Clarke's about that imagination, does he also understand imagination in that way, in a faculty that can be used by mathematicians, or is its imagination more in the way we quite understand it today? Well, so yeah.
Yeah, and you think that the Voltairean use of that term would cohere with what we use it, how we use it today? Or does Voltaire have a technical use of that term in mind too?
I don't know. I think he used it the way we use it today.
Okay, that would make sense too.
But I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think that it is. Wolff is ultimately drawing this from like a Cartesian context and a kind of Cartesian-inspired distinction between the imagination and the intellect. And the reason why he's doing that is because he's drawing this from Tschirnhaus. This is how Tschirnhaus criticizes Descartes as well, despite having a lot of sympathy with Descartes. So yeah, I think it's precisely that there's a worry about not relying on a faculty that provides us with deliverances that are usable for metaphysics proper. Yeah. So is that the whole question, or are you thinking that that ends up in a kind of peculiar situation because Voltaire thinks that Newton's philosophy or his physics is non-imaginary in some relevant sense too, as a kind of response to Wolff or response to this kind of accusation?
No, my question is more about what Wolff means when he talks about those imaginings. Can there be for Wolff distinctive imaginations, which I think they can for Descartes, for example, but I'm not sure that Wolff also uses it in that way.
Yeah, that's a nice way of narrowing it down. So I think that Wolff doesn't think it would be a category mistake to think that there can be distinct imaginings, right? Which is not a way of arguing for the point. It's just a way of rephrasing it. For Wolff, the understanding is definitionally the faculty of distinct cognition, right?
Okay.
So imagination is always going to be in the realm of the confused or indistinct. Yeah.
Okay.
So I think that's just a way of kind of rephrasing Wolff's objection here in terms of his faculty psychology. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. That's clear.
I mean, that question gives me the opportunity to add one thing I wanted to say beforehand, which has nothing to do with your interpretation of Wolff's interpretation of Newton, reading or Newton, but of time and space as used or imagined by Newton himself.
Yeah.
So I think that this distinction, sort of clear-cut distinction made by Wolff between a mathematical or physical use of this of Newton's mathematics and his concepts, and then a metaphysical interpretation, does not quite reflect what Newton is actually doing.
Sure.
I mean, space and time are, of course, interpreted metaphysically, but also physical notions in the sense that, I mean, absolute space provides the possibility of measuring other magnitudes in a sort of container. So it also does work as a physical framing of the argument, not just as a metaphysical general elaboration or byproduct of his physics. Is deeply embedded within his physics. But this is just a reflection.
Like me, Wolff is not a Newton scholar either, but he seems to have been particularly attentive to Newton's work. So
And another thing, which is not really related, but which I came to reflect on because of my own experience, it is about the use of book reviews as a source. So you talked about that a little bit, and I was wondering if you have any ideas how, since Wolff kept on writing reviews for the ACT until at least the 1730s, in my knowledge, but perhaps even later, whether his attitude towards English philosophy and science, particularly Newtonian one, evolved or remained the same. What I have in mind is not strictly related to English science, but to Newtonianism in a way, because I know of a review that Wolff published in 1733 of Maupertuis's first Newtonian tract written in French, where Wolff seems to praise the treatise, or in a way gives a neutral philosophical review, and he writes a letter to Maupertuis to congratulate him, but in coeval correspondence with other people, criticizes Maupertuis and his false presuppositions or whatever. So the review seems to suggested, at least to me, a positive attitude, whereas in other private venues he was very critical. So I was wondering whether
I mean, I think as I said repeatedly, we have to take it with a grain of salt. And it's more interesting. What's more interesting is what Wolff is reading, not deriving certain opinions about it. I find his reviews particularly helpful of his own books, to kind of see what ideas he's foregrounding, how he's comparing them with. I mean, he's writing it anonymously, so nobody knows that Wolff is writing it. And I don't know to what extent that practice was that was the practice at the time. But yeah, you're quite right. We have to be careful. I think there is a difference in context, though. Later on in the 1730s, right? I mean, there's a interposing political context that, Wolff is very much a kind of political operator in addition to being a philosopher, mathematician, and scientist, right? And we're talking about Maupertuis, we're talking about struggles in the Berlin Academy, right? We're talking about the court of Frederick Wilhelm I, and so these are all contexts that intervene that make it hard for Wolff to say what he might think in a review, or that make him want to curry favor with the new incoming treasurer or president of the Berlin Academy, but would make him speak freely to his friends and contemporaries about what he really thinks about it. But yeah, you're quite right. I mean, all of that is important to keep in mind. But I think the context as it develops for Wolff makes it harder to rely to draw those kind of consequences or conclusions from a review. Whereas early on, right, Wolff is he's just starting out, right? He's trying not to piss anybody off, as we all do when we're writing reviews early on. But he's still putting in occasional editorial comments, albeit not early on in his reviews. But later on, you start to see his own perspective shining through in a number of his discussions. Yeah, and also just the choice of things that he's reviewing, right? Like the collection of the letters from Locke's friends. There's a reason why he's doing that, and it becomes very clear in the review that it's because he thinks that Leibniz is treated unfairly by that group. Right. So yeah, there's individual points that I think help to discern an editorial perspective. But I should note that my work through all the reviews was made possible by an edition in the Wolffiana series by Levens. There are actually two of them.
Yeah.
I don't know them personally. I don't know if anybody here does. But they did a dissertation where they found basically a kind of a key that indicated which reviews, like Menke's own copy of the essay submitted for the ACTA, Menke's own copy of the ACTA volumes over the course of his time when it was published, with letters that marked the author of the review, and there was a key that they had from Menke that indicated which person corresponded to which letter. And so they were able to disambiguate, right, and identify these authors. And so Levens also has this edition of all of Wolff's reviews, 3 volumes published over his entire life. I only looked at that in detail up to 1725. I was less interested on everything else, just because it becomes a much more complicated story as Wolff is negotiating his return back to Prussia, or as as Wolff is talking about who should be in charge of the Berlin Academy, these kinds of things. Yeah.
Oh, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was aware of this. That's where I found also the attribution of this review I was interested in to Wolff, because this to me was anonymous.
Yeah, and it's
in a
not
way.
insubstantial, right? I mean, those reviews are really key for seeing who Wolff was reading. And I mean, I have just folders on my computer, right? When I see that Wolff is reviewing a text, I go and get the digitized version and download it. And it's just a substantial, and he's reading constantly. And because these reviews are intended as kind of, high-level summaries of the content of these books, right? He's reading quite carefully too, right? So because he's the one responsible for kind of digesting this and presenting it to the audience of ACTA. So it's much more burdensome reviewing than maybe today.
Yes, I have a different question, or question on a different subject. And I was wondering how exactly Wolff distinguishes between first philosophy, and other disciplines. Yeah, so this is a quote from this at page 68. So first philosophy, clearly, that's ontology. But
Yeah.
what is his? How does he define the scope of philosophy in relation to both first philosophy and other disciplines? Because philosophy is probably broader than metaphysics.
Yeah.
Does it include natural philosophy?
Yeah.
How does he draw the line?
So the place to look for that, at least for his like kind of later views of that, would be the Discourses Preliminares, of course.
But I was wondering if, because he does distinguish the 3 categories, right? I was wondering if already in these early works he has a kind of clear sense of.
I don't think so.
Okay.
I mean, he talks about Weltweisheit.
Yeah.
Which for him just seems to be kind of any discipline in which cognition is involved, right? So it's a very broad definition. But I think, I mean, especially in light of, so there's the Vorbericht von der Weltweisheit at the beginning of the Deutsche Logik, where I think Wolff talks about kind of philosophical cognition, right? So philosophy is less about a discipline than it is about a type of knowing. And so any knowing in virtue of grounds for Wolff counts as philosophical cognition, right? And so as opposed to historical cognition, this distinction becomes reified, and mathematical cognition also distinguished further in the Discourses Preliminares. But I think the historical philosophical distinction is already at the beginning of the Deutsche Logik, at least in one of the editions.
Also trace it back to this text. Maybe not. Yes. So the passage where he mentions philosophy and other disciplines. Is philosophy?
Sorry, but where is this? Which early text? Is this the Ratio Praelectionum?
Yes.
Well, that'd be after the Deutsche Logik. But yeah, this would be possibly another source where you'd want to look at. I mean, there he has the account of his lectures on mathematics, on practical philosophy. Those are all important sources for Wolff's development, but also on logic and on metaphysics.
Yeah. So here you have philosophy and other disciplines, so that would correspond to the distinction between cognition from grounds and cognition.
Maybe. I don't. Where is it? On what page? 67. Is that what you said?
68 in your text. In your chapter, yes, a long block quote.
Oh, okay. The imitation of first philosophy that I've attempted, I recommend the first philosophy, which one tends to call ontology, the use of which is indispensable in philosophy and other disciplines. Yeah, I think that's probably interchangeable with the sciences or something like that. Any domain of knowledge, cognition.
Regardless of whether it's cognition from grounds or.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, well, yeah. I mean, maybe not. I don't know what he means by philosophy there. It's not a term he often uses as a kind of indicating a discipline.
Distinguishes first philosophy from other parts of philosophy. And
he does, yeah.
I thought that was interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, part of it might just be a kind of a loose use of the term because of the, you know, the fact that Wolff was a professor in the faculty of philosophy. And philosophy was everything from mathematics to the arts to the sciences. And so there's a way well in which that naturally applies to, you know, many disciplines,
Yes,
just not
but-
law, medicine, and theology.
Okay, so the other disciplines are theology and medicine.
Maybe, yeah, maybe. Yeah, I'm not sure, but that's possible.
Is there any other final question or remark? Well, if not, let me thank once again Corey for this wonderful
Thanks,
session.
everybody. Thank you for your questions.
Thank you very much.
Thanks very much for the discussion. Yeah.
We'll see you on October the 10th for the second session. Bye, Marie and Boris.
Thank you. Bye.
Take care.
Okay.